Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our parallel event hosted by Noor, held during the 67th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, Building Our Power, Feminists Confronting the Rising Right. My name is Naureen Shameem, Director of Noor, and I want to give a huge thanks to our amazing panelists and to all of you guys for joining. Really looking forward to this discussion. Just to start off with a few sort of framing comments about the sort of discussion and the context in which we're situating this discussion going forward. So why are we holding this event, right? I think that in this moment we have opportunity and crisis, right? It's a moment both where we see multiple and intersecting crises and opportunity to deeply reimagine our world. I think also, if we look at the context, we see ongoing trends of de-democratization with authoritarian and neo-fascist movements increasingly prevalent and powerful across contexts, so more than 50% of the world population. And many have taken advantage, as we know, of the pandemic years and the economic crisis to consolidate deeper authoritarianism and criminalization of our movements. Some of the common elements of the rising right that we're seeing across many countries, just to quickly highlight, firstly, the role of corporate power, right? Where we see neoliberalism acting to hollow out democracy, where we see backdrop of severe inequality breeding hardship and resentment. Secondly, the rise of ethno-nationalist movements and parties who define the nation in racist and other exclusionary ways. Thirdly, spiraling processes of securitization. So for instance, what are some of the manifestations of this? Constant, frequent war on migration, anti-migrant sentiment and framing, use of and misuse of counterterrorism and security powers, surveillance. And then just to flag as well, lastly, and also noting the interplay between these different elements, theocratic religious movements, fundamentalist movements, and these, aside from other factors, really often provide a mass base for regressive governance and ideas around gender and sexuality, and are fundamentally hierarchical and static. And so all of these, through silencing, violence, and repression, they aim to undermine feminist and progressive organizing. The success of the far right, also just to highlight, talking about language, talking about discourse, and the role in terms of some of what we're engaging with, right? The success is often furthered by their vision of society, an ideology of fear, of exclusion, of discrimination, and oftenly what are some of the tropes, right? Evoking religion, culture, tradition, the triad of rhetoric about life, family, and nation, for instance. Often they aim to appropriate the language of progressive movements as well, right? We're seeing that increasingly in many contexts, where there'll be attempts to appropriate anti-imperialist, decolonial language, feminist LGBTIQ language, anti-racist and anti-globalization as well. And here in the latter, there's often a frequent move to try to channel discontent from the negative impact of neoliberal globalization on people's living conditions into support for autocratic, theocratic, repressive movements and power structures. Now, looking on the other end, because obviously we're talking about building our power and talking about feminist movements, speaking about that, I mean, this is directly implicated. As we know, gender justice is as the root of the phenomenon that we're talking about, the far right, authoritarianisms, fundamentalisms, and fascisms, conceptions of the modern nation state, and where we see all of these rooted in heteropatriarchy. Gender and sexuality is central to the ideologies and tactics. And at the same time, we have long histories in the past and ongoing of feminist organizing as a leading force for liberation and deep democracy, where we see feminist movements across regions at the forefront in identifying and analyzing warning signs of fundamentalisms and fascisms, in ground-up, community-based, and innovative forms of organizing, and also feminists developing and growing transformative systemic alternatives, right? Like, for instance, direct democracy. So what's missing? I mean, just to take a step and see, amongst this set of organizers and the different factors and feminist movements and how they're working in different spaces. So despite its rhetoric, which is often, as we mentioned, supranational, very, very nationalist, to a significant extent, the far right organizes transnationally, right? Limited transnational connection and coordination, right? Sharing of tactics and especially collective action are sometimes missing, especially amongst those building strong anti-fundamentalist and fascist movements at the local and national level, and also with long-term anti-fascist and anti-fundamentalist feminist organizing in several regions, especially invisibilized, right? So missing is this kind of connection, coordination, sharing of tactics, at times collective action. And then also sometimes looking at the full picture, right? Looking at trying to achieve feminist structural change and also to be challenging, the far right. There is sometimes limited exchange and coordination between those activists who are working towards transformative feminist alternatives and those who have and are deep in engaging and organizing around with tactical knowledge of the far right. So just lastly to say, in speaking and introducing Noor, who is hosting this parallel event at the CSW. This is a collective effort to address these gaps. Noor is a global feminist and movement-driven think and do tank, devoted to building the power of gender justice and progressive movements to obstruct far-right agendas and to advance our transformative visions. So we coordinate a transnational network, expose and oppose the resurgent right, and build narrative power, and facilitate strategic alignment. Our aim is to organize to help bring systemic alternatives to fascism, fundamentalisms, neocolonialism, and capitalism into reality. And so we see the rising right, as we were saying, are preventing us from reaching our feminist goals of structural change. Through collaborative effort, Noor, with partners, works to address these roadblocks and to achieving our visions of thriving social justice, deep democracy, and human rights, with the aim of building our power, developing long-term strategies to advance feminist transformation. So it's a pleasure to be here with our esteemed panelists and moderator here today. We aim to create a conversation today on the work of feminist movements to disrupt and challenge the rising right in multiple regions worldwide. Also, in terms of our deep understandings of transnational solidarity, and on how we can collectively address roadblocks to achieving transformative change. Joining us today are our esteemed speakers and our moderators, Cynthia Rothschild, who is an independent activist and consultant with a focus on United Nations advocacy and policy, sexual rights, LGBT issues, HIV and AIDS, and women human rights defenders. She's currently the director of the UN program at Occidental College. A human rights, sexual rights, and feminist activist for over 20 years, she has worked with global networks and NGOs within and outside the US. Welcome, Cynthia, and handing over to you.
Great. Okay, hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Lovely to join you. And Naureen, thanks for the warm welcome. Thanks to our great speakers. I'll say a little bit more about our speakers in a moment. First, we are recording, so probably good just to flag that for everyone. And okay, that's all in terms of that housekeeping part. Just a couple of words on the flow of this session. So in a moment, I'm going to do a very brief introduction to our speakers, but then before each person really takes the microphone, I'll do a slightly deeper introduction, and then after each speaks for about 5 minutes or so, I will come back to them with a small, I was going to say handful, it's not even a handful, but with a few questions. And then we're going to look to you in the audience as participants also for posing questions toward the end of the session. So I want to encourage you to use the Q&A function there as we roll along, and as we go on ahead, first thing you should know is that I'm working off about 4 sheets of paper, so you're going to see me toggling between different things because it's that kind of day. I want to first then do this nod toward the amazing people who we have joining us today. So if I could ask you as panelists just to raise your hand as I say your name, and this will be the order of the speakers. So we've got Rozana Isa from Sisters in Islam, and Rozana is based in Malaysia. Then we have Anthea Taderera, who is from Zimbabwe, living in Geneva with the Sexual Rights Initiative. Then we'll have Zubaida Akbar with Freedom Now. And Zubaida is in the US, but with a focus on Afghanistan. Then we have Thilaga Sulathireh. I hope did I nail your last name? Close enough? All right, close enough. Sorry. Justice for Sisters, also based in Malaysia. And our final speaker will be Sussan Tahmasebi with Feminist, based in the US and with a focus on Iran. The next thing that I will say is that while we are focusing on issues and fundamentalisms outside the US, I just want to say a quick word about placing the United States and Canada to some extent, but the United States as an actor in this landscape, as an actor who in various ways supports extremisms outside of US borders, including in the states and regions that we will be addressing today, and that's through foreign policy, military sales, direct NGO support through any number of ways. So in the United States, there's a support of extremisms outside the US, and also obviously within the United States, we're in a particularly difficult moment in terms of various expressions of extremisms and hatred and fear mongering, and a number of bad things here. With that said, Rozana, I'm going to turn to you now. I'm going to jump to your bio. Let me just do this quickly, and we'll dive in. So Rozana Isa is currently the executive director for Sisters in Islam, a Malaysian NGO working on women's rights within the framework of Islam. She joined the Malaysian women's rights movement in 1999 to address violence against women. This exposed her to the challenges Muslim women face to have their rights recognized and exercised in the context of Islamicization within a democratic nation with parallel legal systems. While gender, ethnic, and religious diversities are celebrated in society, yet negated at different levels of policies and laws, before taking up Sisters in Islam's helm, Rozana worked with several national, regional, and international women's rights organizations. So, Rozana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. So I want to share that I am speaking in the context of the work that we do in Sisters in Islam as Muslim feminists to uphold Muslim women's rights in Malaysia. We work within a framework of Islam that is progressive, the application of human rights principles, constitutional guarantees, and the lived realities of women and men on the ground. And the challenges faced, the reality that, politicization of Islam has been going on for almost 40 years, that has led to political parties out-Islamizing each other to garner the votes of the Muslim majority voters in Malaysia. We are also facing the challenge of a national education system that has been regressing over time and even politicized. And that has not only affected the quality of learning and critical thinking, but has also affected the understanding of the diversity and plurality of Malaysian society, leading to increased intolerance of ethnic, religious, and sexuality differences, as well as the idea of the supremacy of Islam and ethnic Malays. We also face the reality of the bureaucratization and institutionalization of Islam, which has strengthened conservative interpretations of Islam that don't meet with the lived realities and experiences, and that includes the formulation of laws and policies that have yet to fully embrace the ideals and ideas of gender equality. And so over time, all of this has led to tensions in the legal framework, tensions within the parallel legal systems that we have, this whole competing authority between federal versus state laws in relation to lawmaking as well as judiciary, because Islam is a state matter. in Malaysia. It's kind of like coordinated at the federal level, but essentially each state, and there are 14 states in Malaysia, actually has their own religious laws, religious authorities. And so you are essentially dealing with 15 different kinds and more, in fact, of the different religious authorities. And the more recent phenomenon, when I say recent, I would say actually it's been a long time, but for years, they have been, religious authorities are beginning to increasingly use fatwas or religious edict, to create laws or policies and control, essentially, of Muslim women's rights, Muslim women's bodily autonomy, how we look, what we do, how we dress. And the reality is also that even though it's supposedly only supposed to impact the Muslim population in Malaysia, indirectly it actually impacts on non-Muslim citizens as well. And so the whole idea of all these competing jurisdictions, competing laws, it really becomes very, very difficult, and it is a struggle essentially. And in terms of how we are dealing with this as a group, yes, we are sisters in Islam, but essentially we identify ourselves as feminists, and we uphold human rights, and we also believe in the ideals and principles that are within Islam. And for the past few years, what we've been doing in terms of trying to challenge all these notions and impact of authorizations is, we've been doing a lot of legal challenges, defending our fundamental human rights through challenging, any kind of, the legal challenges. They try to ban our books. They put up a legal challenge to get rid of Islam in our name, Sisters in Islam, because they're saying what we're doing is un-Islamic. And then there's also a fatwa against Sisters in Islam since 2014, that declared us as deviants for subscribing to liberalism and religious pluralism. And we've been engaged in the civil courts for 9 years. We just got a decision from the Court of Appeal 2 days ago, and we lost. It's been 9 years and we lost. There have been some gains. It's kind of like pull back, push back. Essentially they're saying since we're challenging the contents of the fatwa, because we're saying that actually they do not have the mandate and jurisdiction to create these kinds of fatwas. And we're taking our arguments, from the view of the federal constitution, and they're saying no, you should not go to the civil courts. You should go to the Sharia courts, and this is something that we're insisting. Essentially, what we're doing is we are trying to defend the fundamental rights through the federal constitution. Lastly, I just want to say that aside from the legal challenges, we've been focusing on youth issues. We've also been addressing discourse, reclaiming the identity of moderation and openness that existed in our cultural traditions of non-segregation in public through arts, music, dances, and rereading the books and literature within the Southeast Asia region that are empowering and inspiring about women. And lastly, we're actually organizing to engage about conservatism. I mean, there's this whole range of, whether it's fundamentalism, extremism, but essentially we think that it starts with conservatism, and that's where we are going in with different kinds of strategies and approaches to do this. Thank you so much.
Rozana, thank you. Anthea, we're going to turn to you, and let me just introduce you a little bit more deeply. Anthea is an African feminist lawyer from Zimbabwe with expertise in sexual rights and a keen interest in African feminist approaches to human rights law and policy. She currently works on rights relating to gender and sexuality in the international human rights system, particularly through the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. Anthea.
Thanks, Cynthia, and thank you, Noor, for having me. The situation in the Geneva-based human rights system, here I'm thinking particularly of the Human Rights Council and the UPR, with regards to fundamentalisms, is complex and continuously in flux. It's influenced by domestic and international factors. As a primarily political space, it is also impacted and influenced by geopolitical developments, foreign policy priorities, economic interests, trade relations, etc., in addition to international human rights law norms and issues. Both states and non-state actors are implicated in perpetuating fundamentalisms across issues, reinforcing systems of oppression, such as patriarchy, cis-heterosexism, racism, capitalism, and fueling the various democratic crises that we can see in our world today. I think we're all familiar with the sex-gender discourses, in all the diversity discourses. What is the human rights-based approach discourse? What does racism have to do with rights discourse? There's no such thing as a right to bodily autonomy discourse, to name a few amongst the greatest hits prevalent in this space. More states are implicated in fundamentalisms than we may think. We just have to look at how difficult it is within the Human Rights Council to advance a genuine politic of economic justice by consensus that can diagnose the problems of capitalism, challenge the neoliberal status quo, and provide for a more equitable alternative for the benefit of all peoples, and not just the select citizens of a select few countries. Not all states participate constructively or even at all in discourse that centers economic, social, and cultural rights and the urgency around their fulfillment. It is difficult to have states take seriously the fundamental interrelatedness between the international human rights framework and the material conditions that peoples in the world live in, to relate the current economic and political order and apparatus to the enjoyment of rights. They struggle to understand that you don't need to be an economist to see an economic problem, that economic justice is a conversation and a priority for all, for everyone, even human rights lawyers. Too many states claim to recognize the interdependence of rights while still tending to regard civil and political rights as the most important, and they remain committed to hierarchizing these rights and committed to individualism and to capitalism. The issue of individualizing rights is not a new one. Indeed, we still have states that refuse to acknowledge the right to development as a collective right and to acknowledge a joint responsibility to meet the obligations of this right. And they refuse to acknowledge the context of neocolonialism that directly implicates the global north in the exploitation of the South in order to sustain their own development and growth. States refuse to grapple with structural issues and their material consequences. Countries in the global north in particular claim not to understand why inequality is a problem. They allege that they cannot see how economic, financial, and security factors directly impact the ability of states to meet all of our economic, social, and cultural rights. These same states claim to not understand what occupation, unilateral coercive measures, foreign debt, colonialism, labor rights, and indeed access to COVID vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, and a TRIPS waiver on the same, have to do with human rights. We can provide many examples, of course. The pandemic continues to highlight cracks in our economic systems and the imperative for true universal health coverage provided by the state with no user fees. When this pandemic hit, states of the global north left the global south for dead, first through vaccine nationalism, and then through refusing to agree to the TRIPS waiver as originally tabled by South Africa and India. This is despite Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, giving us all the right to benefit from scientific progress and its application, a right too many states choose to read as an individual right between a citizen and their state, and not a collective right tied to global cooperation and economic justice that is divorced from market logic and the quest for never-ending mega profits. An example of interrelatedness. In order to access sexual and reproductive health services, we need to have a functioning health system that has not collapsed due to austerity measures, sanctions, or conflicts, and which has not been privatized, so that it can be used by all according to their needs, regardless of class. The health system needs to have enough health personnel who earn a fair wage and who work in a safe environment with access to water, electricity, medicines, and equipment. We must have a public education system that can train health workers. The health centers must be available, accessible. There must be good infrastructure in terms of roads for transporting patients and goods. And we need good public transportation in order for people to be able to access the health services. The inability to fully embed individuals in their material context, their communities, their countries, their regions within an economic system when considering what it means to respect, protect, and fulfill rights persists. This is an approach that feeds into a culture of impunity and a lack of accountability for violations of economic, social, and cultural rights within the space. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthea. I wrote down, you don't need to be an economist to see an economic problem. I like that line very much. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on, and Zubaida Akbar is up next. And Zubaida, let me just read a little bit of your bio as an introduction. So, Zubaida Akbar is a leading women's rights and civil society activist from Afghanistan. She has over a decade of experience working inside Afghanistan to promote equality, women and children's rights, and democracy. She's currently based in the US, where she's lived since 2018. She also serves on the advisory board of Femina, an organization that supports women human rights defenders, including Afghan WHRDs and feminist movements. She's been deeply involved in addressing the recent crisis in Afghanistan, and throughout her career, Zubaida has worked with various international organizations inside and outside Afghanistan as a communication campaign and advocacy expert. She holds an undergrad degree in law and political science. So Zubaida, over to you.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks to Noor for this opportunity. I am honored to speak alongside this wonderful panel. Women in Afghanistan have been most impacted by the return of the Taliban to power in August 2021, and women's movements have been resisting the Taliban's oppression in the most creative ways close to 2 years now. We have seen Taliban quickly reverting to the policies they implemented to systematically erase women from public spaces in the 90s when they were last in power. They're imposing an extremist patriarchal interpretation of Islam that relies on a repression of women and marginalized groups. Before the fall of Afghanistan into the hands of Taliban, for a second time, women had a vibrant role in media and civil society as executives, reporters, producers, and the rates of enrollment to education was increasing despite security threats that the Taliban posed on women's education during the 20 years of conflict. Women made up 24% of the parliament and 21% of civil servants, 18% of which were in senior management levels. There were laws and regulations in place to protect women against violence. There were flaws and obstacles, of course, but the country was moving forward, despite Taliban's targeted attacks on women, civil society, media, and marginalized ethnic and religious groups, which escalated over the years. However, in September 2021, in August, Taliban took power. In September 2021, the first thing that they did was dismantle the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Afghanistan to pass a message across to women of Afghanistan, of course. And they replaced this ministry with the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which oversees the implementation of Islamic Sharia based on their own interpretation. Under the Taliban, women are facing a complete erasure from public spaces. Women are deprived of livelihoods, identity, and dignified lives. Today, women in Afghanistan are banned from employment, except for very limited areas of health and education sectors. And in December 2022, Taliban banned women's employment in international NGOs, in international and national NGOs. The right to free movement of women is restricted due to Taliban's mahram, male guardian requirement, which has impacted even women's access to life-saving services such as health. We hear from women that they go to health facilities to do their routine checkups or even for emergency cases, and they're turned away for not having a male minder. With Taliban's ban on secondary and university level education, most women have no access to formal education. And Afghanistan is the only country where women are banned from accessing to education by the rulers. Taliban also are back to extrajudicial killings, public floggings, execution, and stoning of women and others that oppose them. Afghanistan has faced a collapse of the legal system because Taliban dismantled all the laws and regulations that were in place before. This means women are facing domestic violence and they have no legal remedies. And most recently, we heard that the Taliban issued a circular to the divorce law during the Republic, which now requires women to return to their husbands if they were divorced during the past 20 years. These are just some of the examples of type of restrictions that Taliban are imposing on women in Afghanistan under the name of Islam. They have issued over 42 decrees aiming to restrict the rights of women only. Human rights defenders, the human rights community from Afghanistan, and even some international stakeholders refer to this situation as gender apartheid. Despite all of this bad news and the increasing attacks on the rights of women every day, women in Afghanistan have staged a civic resistance across the country. They have mobilized in groups and they have been demanding for their rights and protesting under the slogan, food, work, and freedom. So far, their civic resistance has gone largely unacknowledged by the international community that was involved in Afghanistan for 20 years, by countries with feminist foreign policies, and even regional countries with common cultural and religious values. If anything, we see the broader international community appeasing the Taliban and going along with their religious and cultural justifications for the restrictions they impose on women. And we feel that the international community is even disregarding their own values as far as universal human rights goes. I think I'm going to stop here now and happy to speak further on this issue when I'm given a chance later.
Okay. All right. Zubaida, thank you so very much. Our next speaker will be Thilaga Sulathireh. And please step in and correct me if I've done a terrible job of naming your surname. Thilaga is a community organizer and researcher in Malaysia. Thilaga works largely with a focus on gender, sexuality, and human rights. They're a founding member of several LGBTIQ++ campaigns and initiatives, including Justice for Sisters and Queer Lapis. Thilaga, over to you.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. Thanks so much for having me on this panel. I'm really happy to be on this panel, just like everybody else. I think this is a timely webinar because we, as queer people in Malaysia, are currently facing backlash following the Women's March that took place last weekend in Malaysia. And central to the backlash that we're facing is, the issues around LGBTIQ people's participation in the march. I think it's also important to note that the backlash that we're facing at the moment is taking place against the backdrop of increasing LGBT phobia in Malaysia. In the past 5 years, we have seen increased criminalization of LGBT people under state Sharia laws, regulation of LGBT content and freedom of expression, namely through banning of LGBT books, prosecution of content creators that feature LGBT persons, and introduction of new prohibition against gender expression. We also see state-funded anti-LGBT programs centered around rehabilitation of LGBT persons and increasing hateful speech, discrimination, misinformation, etc. I do want to add that the media also highlights introduction of restrictive laws against LGBT people under the Taliban rule or in other authoritarian regime as good practices in the media. If you look at the comments on these reports, online users are for Malaysia adopting similar measures against LGBT people, or at least praise these horrible practices, right? despite the fact that Malaysia has gone through political changes in recent years, what is interesting that this has not affected federal and state Islamic departments that regulate Islam in Malaysia. These bodies also oversee all state-funded anti-LGBT activities. One of the strategies used by the state, and we see similarities of these strategies in Indonesia too, is to use the notion of compassion and love to change or rehabilitate LGBT people, right? And to say that rehabilitation is a better alternative than jailing and imprisoning LGBT people. So then it is seen as a compassionate way to return LGBT people to the right path. So for some queer people, of course, we are aware of these insidious tactics, but not so much allies, right? Or heterosexual cisgender people who believe that these government agencies are genuinely trying to approach and help LGBT people. Two other trends that I would like to highlight is one, the anti-gender and anti-rights discourse promoted by non-state actors and state actors alike. On one hand, these ideas are homegrown, as we have seen these trends since early 2000s, especially during the UPR process. On the other hand, anti-rights groups are also adopting and localizing anti-rights and anti-gender discourse using a religious lens. Two, I think there is also a weaponization of HIV and PrEP. HIV is often used insidiously to reinforce the notion that HIV is a form of divine retribution for LGBT people, as we are perceived as sinners, right? Following the recent introduction of a PrEP pilot project, for people in Malaysia, we also saw how anti-rights groups were pushing for restriction of PrEP for LGBT people. As to them, this, by providing LGBT people with life-saving medicine, it will normalize the notion of LGBT. Although the pilot project is funded by the Global Fund, and it is not at all funded by the government, we also saw how anti-rights groups taking the position that their taxpayers' money should not be used for life-saving medicine for LGBT people. So there's the whole moralization of taxpayers' money. As we're dealing with these things, Justice for Sisters, the group that I'm with, believe that it's important for us to, one, strengthen our movement building efforts, two, as LGBT groups are largely under-resourced, we also believe it's important for us to use our resources strategically and wisely to also reduce burnout, right? Not just so that our programs are more streamlined, but burnout is also a huge issue. And also to continue to explore strategic litigation and other strategies while ensuring that we strengthen LGBTIQ persons' access to information, especially in relation to redress option, rights, among others. And lastly, I think we also believe in increasing evidence at this point so that then we can surface the impact of the current environment on LGBT people and others. Thank you.
Thilaga, thank you so much. Let's jump to Sussan Tahmasebi, our final speaker for this round. Sussan Tahmasebi is the director of Femina, an organization that promotes gender equality and supports women human rights defenders, their organizations, and feminist movements in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia regions. Femina is especially focused on contexts where civil society space is constrained and where there's growing authoritarianism, extremism, and conflict. Sussan has over 20 years of experience in promoting women's rights, peace, and security at the national, regional, and international levels. Between 1999 and 2011, Sussan was based in Iran, where she worked on promoting women's rights and building the capacity of civil society. And then since 2011, her work has focused on promotion of women's rights, peace, and security in the MENA region. She is Iranian and American by birth and currently lives in the US. Sussan, thanks.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you so much to Naureen and Noor for organizing this really important discussion. I'm going to be speaking today about the broader MENA region and trends that I see in the MENA region, but I'll give examples about how women are responding from the Iranian context, which I think many of you have probably been following in recent months. But what we see across, and the reason why I want to do this is because the trends that I'm talking about are very true about Iran, but really they're true about the entire region. And I think it's really important to look at these as regional and perhaps even global trends, what's happening, but with the special dynamics of the MENA region. So what we see in the MENA region is growing authoritarianism. This is happening with a nod and a wink, maybe sometimes a little bit more than a nod and a wink by the international community that's very afraid of religious governments coming to power, as we saw following the Arab Spring 10 years ago. So governments, in response to rising religious political groups and their rise to power following the Arab Springs, are taking a much more authoritarian stance against their own citizens. And the international community seems to be fine with this, especially given the conflicts. The international community is very afraid of increased conflicts and migration to the West. So there's incredibly rapid shrinking of civic space. Many of the countries are either closed civic spaces, even countries like Tunisia that were kind of the hope and the model for the region are rapidly the space is rapidly shrinking. Governments are doing this largely, as I said, in response to potentially growing extremism, but these governments are also either, if they're not religious, if they're religious, in the case of Iran, they're religious, but if they're not religious, they're already very much aligned with and working very closely with conservative religious groups that somehow align with the government. So really all of this is a ruse, in a sense, that they're countering religious extremism, but they're also very much religiously extremist themselves. With a very strong hand. As we see the shrinking space, we also see a response from human rights defenders, especially women human rights defenders, because a lot of this extremism, this religious approach and this authoritarianism is also very much targeted towards women, contesting their rights to bodily autonomy, their presence in the public space as they demand more rights. And much of this is happening, but much of the backlash against human rights defenders, and especially women human rights defenders, is happening under the guise of countering terrorism and countering threats to national security. So everything that women demand or other human rights groups demand, even if it's just rights, even if it doesn't have necessarily to do with democracy, that questions the authority of the state, is couched it's framed as terrorism or undermining national security, which makes it much easier to suppress and to carry out crackdowns against these groups. We see this across the region, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or in Turkey or in Iran or even Tunisia, as I mentioned. There's a culture of impunity. I think other speakers spoke about this. There's a culture of impunity, a lack of accountability on the parts of many of these governments, which again upsets the citizens and mobilizes them. And then we see in many of the countries in the region, we see a massive economic crisis. This is the case in Iran. It's also the case in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Turkey, which again creates a lot of instability and insecurity for citizens. And at the UN level, we see these governments very effectively countering international human rights mechanisms in the name of culture, religion, and also state sovereignty. I think they're doing this in partnership with other states, including European states that are also moving more towards fascism. So we see the international structures and international human rights guarantees breaking down precisely at a time when there's growing extremism and there's a securitized approach towards the citizenry of people in this region. And then, I think many people have watched what's happened in Iran in the past months. So in Iran, attempts by Iranian women's movement and by other movements to create reform, to make demands of the government have consistently failed for the last 20 years. Whatever they've asked for, people have been charged with national security crimes and been arrested, and the state has refused to respond even to the most minimal demands. So people have risen up. They've taken to the streets. They're demanding accountability. They're demanding an end to impunity. They're demanding fundamental freedoms. What they're not demanding, I think at least what we're not hearing as much about is political freedoms. But I think that those political freedoms, are actually something that the citizens are asking for. But because we see this as a populist protest movements, that people are mostly asking for fundamental freedoms, mostly focused on social change. But we see these kinds of protests across the region. It's not just in Iran, as Zubaida mentioned, it's also in Afghanistan and many of these other countries. If there's space to protest and to demand change, people are asking for it. So this is not a unique development inside the country, but I think what's happening in Iran and is extremely unique is the fact that these protests are very much centered on women and women's issues, and they're seen as a feminist movement. And I think that this, holds a potential for the entire region to follow suit or to take lessons from, as Iranians have long taken lessons from other countries in the region. So I'll stop there and we can talk more about Iran and also the region in the next section.
Okay, thank you so much, Sussan. So in the next section, I'm going to pose some specific questions to all of you or some of you. And in the section following that, we're going to take Q&A from the participants. So first, let me encourage those of you who are watching and are participants, please use the Q&A for additional questions. But first, I'm going to pose a few additional questions to our panelists and just ask you for quick responses on these. So I'm wondering if each of you can say something about solidarity and about transnational solidarity in particular, and organizing and network building in terms of supporting movements. You've all named a series of challenges that are very real and compelling and intimidating. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more in terms of looking to, in large part, feminist solidarity and other movement solidarity in terms of achieving our visions for not only addressing these challenges, but creating a different universe. So why don't we go in the order of the initial presentations, which means that Rozana, we're going to go to you first.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. No, definitely. I mean, it's so important not to feel alone doing this work. And we're very, very fortunate because, we have networks not only at the global level, but I think in the more recent years, in the last 10 years, what we've also been trying to do is to strengthen the network within the regional level of those groups that are doing similar kind of work and have similar kind of contexts and challenges. We're definitely inspired by our friends in Singapore, as well as in Indonesia. Amazing things are happening in Indonesia where women ulama are the ones who are spearheading for knowledge production. They're building arguments, in support of gender equality. They're embarking on, very amazing strategies of communications, engagement, and content building. And with groups such as Musawa, which is the global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family, there have been opportunities for strategic interventions with international instruments, mechanisms, and platforms. Really, it's essential. And I think all these opportunities, ways of networking, ways of engaging and exchange really, gives us the build-up in terms of what can be done. At the very least, even though contextually it may be a little bit different, but the ideas are really very, very inspirational. And right now, I mean, the country that we look forward to the most is Indonesia. Really, I think on opportunities for them to actually come on board and speak up and showcase what they're doing is essential, because I think right now the voices of Indonesian women, they're coming out loud, but I think globally, we need to hear more from them. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rozana. Anthea.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think transnational solidarity is important when you're situated in Geneva for several reasons. On the one hand, to ensure that we're continuously accountable to movements and are participating in movement work in different countries, that we don't exist in like a Geneva bubble where we think we have a complete analysis, all of the solutions, all of the ideas. It's important to remain connected and dynamic in that way. It's also important for us to have a sense of the contours of the discourses that are appearing at the international spaces, because with states and with far-right actors, in civil society, Geneva is not the first place they tried that argument or that discourse. It's appeared somewhere else at a national level. It's appeared somewhere else at a regional level. And so it's really important to continue having conversations with people at a national level, at a regional level, to really discuss how discourses and ideologies are spilling over from the different spaces, and how we're getting new traits of patriarchy that are coming maybe from Africa and are showing up in the conversations in Geneva. It's also really important to remain rooted in movements and for people to act from where they are. So if we're thinking, for example, with the campaigning around the TRIPS waiver, and those like the Feminists for People's Vaccine, but you also had national organizations targeting their own specific governments, identifying how specific countries have been putting roadblocks in terms of advancing economic justice in this particular arena. And so it really helps when you have different feminists in different places really leveraging their positionality and using the power and the access they have in their different places for the greater good. And we do our bit here in Geneva.
Thanks, Anthea. Zubaida.
Sorry, thank you. It took me a minute. So I think in the case of Afghanistan, it's a bit different because after in August 2021, Afghanistan faced a total collapse of the formal civil society structures. Everything that we had as civil society, informal structures, they entirely collapsed. Their executives were evacuated to other countries. Their offices were shut down. And then we saw these grassroots movements, mostly led by women, forming, right? Which are all very young. And these movements are formed by women from different walks of life. They're teachers, civil servants, students who woke up and they saw that they had lost everything. And that their initial response was that we are going to go out on the street, protest and resist this. And their protests obviously also took different forms and shapes, considering how they have been attacked in many different ways by the Taliban. So it's they are growing, they are learning, and they are adapting every day under circumstances where the civic space is continuously under increased attack. So in August 2021, they could go on the street and protest. Now that's not possible anymore, because so many of them were arrested, so many of them were killed, so many of them were tortured. They are finding other creative ways to be able to raise their voices. In that sense, I think solidarity and regional networks and regional support and connections is extremely important for these movements, especially connections with other countries who have been exposed to similar oppressive regimes, for them to learn how they can mobilize, how they can resist this regime together, from the lessons that they can learn from the region. And they also, I think women inside Afghanistan, they also look at other countries in the region, specifically those with similar cultures and similar religions, not just to learn, not just for learning lessons from these movements, but to also to get some solidarity, some acknowledgement for what they have been doing in their country, which I think is very important, because the roots of oppression is the same. And we have seen incidents where something happens in Iran and women in Afghanistan respond, and they stage a protest. They show a sign of solidarity, and the other way around. I think this is happening. We are seeing it, but it needs to expand. It needs to grow, and there needs to be an opportunity for that. It might take a while for movements inside Afghanistan because they're young. Everything happens so abruptly. They could go to school, work, live normal lives yesterday, and they woke up and it was all gone. And now they're in a place where they are fighting, resisting basically a terrorist group that's in charge.
Thanks, Zubaida. Thilaga, let's go to you.
Thanks so much. I agree with folks about the importance of transnational network. I myself have benefited from global and regional networks as a young activist. I'm also invested in strengthening regional networks as I see how it can help activists, right? As what Rozana said, to not be alone in the work that we do. And also, for a lot of queer people, sometimes, folks feel alone in the work that they do because they come from hostile environments, right? I think there are several things, as we are talking about transnational movement building, I think there are several things that we could consider. The first one is, I think, in ensuring representation of people from the global south. As a queer person from Southeast Asia, I think we often don't see as much meaningful representation of folks from the region. Although we see serious repression against civil society, feminist groups, LGBT groups in the region by authoritarian governments and also anti-rights groups. At the same time, we also see really vibrant organizing by feminists and queer folks in Southeast Asia, right? For example, feminist and queer movements are at the forefronts of protests for democracy in Thailand, in Myanmar, among other places. The second thing that I would like to put out to the multiverse is I also come from a context where LGBT people are criminalized, and the backlash that we deal with is multi-pronged, right? On one hand, we have to deal with the homegrown anti-LGBT stuff, and then on the other hand, we also have to deal with reaction by conservatives to all sorts of LGBT-related news, progress, regression, etc. So sometimes these regressions, sometimes these reactions can manifest in sustained panic over a period of time, right? For example, the same-sex marriage panic that we have seen being sustained in many, many countries and many, many contexts over the years, right? So I think a transnational network building is critical in addressing these interconnected issues and to dismantle oppression everywhere. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Thilaga. And Sussan, over to you.
So yes, of course, I think those people who know me have heard me say this many times before. The Iranian women's movement, the feminists in Iran, are one of the most isolated groups internationally. They, because of state repression and because of sanctions and the economic crisis, they have very, very little opportunity to connect with their peers in the region and internationally. Especially the younger generation is very much interested in connecting with their peers in the region. It's difficult, of course, because they're beyond the repression and the inability to travel and also to be invited to regional gatherings. There's language barriers that make it very difficult, and I think politics that make it very difficult. With the recent protests in Iran following the in-custody death of Mahsa Jina Amini, I think many people are looking at sort of with a different lens at the Iranian women's movement and Iranian women, including those from the region, and they're more receptive to engaging. We've been trying to connect Iranian women activists to their counterparts in the region for many years. And I think among the younger generation, within the region, there's also greater receptivity to this connection. But I think it's absolutely critical. Not only can they learn from one another, but they can also share lessons learned. I think there's a lot of lessons both for Iranians to learn, but also to share, because they've worked in a very repressive context. They continue to have a relatively strong civil society and women's movement, despite the fact that they can't have any formal organization. So I think they have a lot of lessons to share, but they also have a lot of lessons to learn, especially from the region, who's also experienced serious transition. Many people think that these protests are the start of a transition. Hopefully they are a start of a transition towards a more democratic, inclusive Iran. But I think that there are many lessons that Iranians can learn from their counterparts regionally. What we've seen as the protests have waned a bit, that we see the voices outside the country rising and offering solutions very rapid, and they're pressing for an expedited solution to what's happening inside the country that doesn't very much represent actually what's happening inside the country. It's not very much in line with the slogan of the Iranians, women, life, and freedom. It's very top down, outside in. It doesn't take into account the demands of Iranians. It doesn't take into account many of their voices. And the people who've gotten the most attention outside the country are actually those who are very much aligned with right-wing groups. They're being invited by Europeans, fascist European parliaments. They're supported by Saudi Arabia, possibly many of us think by right-wing Israelis. So it's very much counter to what's happening inside the country. And I mentioned about how the protest maybe is not articulating political demands in the sense, this is also something that's gone from the inside. We need, the message is we need to come together to overthrow this regime. Nobody should ask any questions about what the future government style is going to look like. And this is extremely problematic. So we want to hear what people are saying about how they envision their future. And what I hear is that many young people are now recognizing inside the country that they have to slow down and actually talk about the models, talk about what they envision. They're having intense conversations about the future of the country. So this is very positive, and we could use examples of what's happened in other countries. Another thing that international solidarity and this networking and inclusion will counter is to make sure that people inside the country are actually present in spaces at the international level where decisions are being made and where Iran is being discussed. We haven't had this for decades, and we certainly need it now, and we can't have it. Part of that is repression, but a big part of it also is, sanctions, the fact that there's no funding to include Iran. So hopefully, if things open up a bit inside the country, we will see the emergence of activists and feminists, especially, who are working inside the country in these international spaces so they can represent their own issues and speak about their future from their own perspectives instead of having those outside do it.
Thanks, Sussan. I'm going to jump to another series of questions, and I don't know that we'll have time for all of you to respond to each of these. So let me toss these out again. Quick responses. So one of the things that we see clearly across the divide of global north and south and east west is the oppression of women, but also queer communities, LGBTIQ++ communities, and also the weaponization of anti-trans, anti-queer, and just generally sexist misogyny, but the weaponization in particular of anti-trans sentiment, the reification of gender norms, gender binaries, etc. And I wonder if I could toss this question to connect that weaponization to issues of substantive democracy. And Thilaga, I'm going to start with you, and then maybe Zubaida, go to you for quick responses here. So Thilaga, let me start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to say that I identify as non-binary along the non-binary spectrum. So, of course, like I think trans women are women, and like gender identity of people must be respected. And these are all things that are rooted in science and facts and lived experiences and can be explained through history and so many things, right? So there is no reason for us to like even doubt that trans women are women and like and dismiss their gender identity, right? And I think this is really unfeminist for us to do, right? Like to exclude people because of their right to self, because of how they define themselves. And so I just think that, of course, we are dealing with a lot of layers of gender ideology, across the globe. And in Malaysia, we are also dealing with gender ideology. But I think, I think one way for us to get out of this is also to continuously affirm that gender is a spectrum. And again, trans women, non-binary people, people across the gender spectrum exist, right? And I think this affirmation is, even though it may look so simple, but I think it is extremely critical in making sure that people actually have rights and have access to opportunities, services, and information. I really agree that the oppression against women and LGBTIQ people are central to authoritarianism. We see this in the trend of criminalization, regulation of civic spaces and freedoms, among others, all across the world, right? I think in the context that I come from, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most pressing issues is the removal of autonomy, especially bodily autonomy, and the right to self-determination by the right wing or the far right groups, right? And I think what is really interesting as well, this removal of bodily autonomy, and right to self-determination within the framework of religion or the misuse of religion, I think it also then it doesn't only exclude LGBT people from the practice of religion, but it also then reinforces shame against LGBT, reinforces the shame within LGBT people, right? And I think this is extremely dangerous because, as we know, LGBT people or queer folks already, especially like, religious folks, some religious folks may already have decreased self-acceptance. So the fact that, this reinforcement of shame and exclusion, it just reinforces this from the broader society, right? I think it is also interesting that, the way in which that these bodily autonomy and self-determination is deprived of from LGBTIQ people, it also then creates a lot of division within the LGBT community, right? Between those who are more risk averse and against and those who more willing to take risks. For example, there is a division between like human rights, LGBTIQ human rights defenders and non-LGBTIQ defenders, right? And often these two groups are pitted against each other for like, because and LGBTIQ human rights defenders are seen as doing way too much, being extra and all of that for seeking rights, right? And I mean, it is understandable because folks live in a hostile context where, with the overwhelming shame that they face, it's very difficult to see their rights. But yeah, I guess this is a problem that we have to deal with. But another issue that we face in this context of in this right-wing context, other than the misuse of religion and monopoly of religion, is also the misuse of public morality and public order, where we have seen the use of public morality and public order in the context of restriction of LGBTIQ people's freedom of expression, and also in framing it as promotion of LGBT lifestyle, right? I also agree with Sussan that we are constantly competing for space with anti-rights group in rights spaces, right? And this can be at the UN or in the NHRI spaces or in spaces where we're talking about national level policies, right? So I think this kind of competition also then really derails the work that we do and adds more barriers and challenges for us to speak out. I think, as I mentioned earlier as well, what I find really interesting is that in Malaysia, Southeast Asia, we are seeing more and more LGBTIQ groups moving out of their SOGI SC bubble and the LGBTIQ focused advocacy. LGBTIQ folks and feminist movements are coming together with other human rights defenders, and they see the importance of being part of democratic movements, because I think a lot of folks are aware that we need to be part of democratic movements in order to affect the change that we want to see. I'm also happy to be on this panel with Rozana because, with Rozana and Sisters in Islam, we have developed, stronger relationships with like Muslim feminists and all kinds of feminists, right? Which we did not prior to this. I think having the support and solidarity of Sisters in Islam for queer folks in Malaysia is really empowering. And I think this has also made, some of us and LGBT groups in Malaysia inspired to do more on religion and to challenge this religious, hegemony in Malaysia. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay,
I don't know
thanks,
if I answered the question.
So, all right. So listen, I'm doing a quick time check here, and there are a few other questions that I'd like to direct to some of you, and we're starting to weave in questions from the Q&A. So, it's a free for all now. Let's see how this goes. So, Zubaida, I'm going to pose that same last question that Thilaga responded to you. Just ask you for a quick response, but look at if you could connect some of the questions about the weaponization, the either anti-LGBT or anti-feminist attacks, but connect those to issues of democracy, and then I'll take another spin after that. So Zubaida, let me just ask you for a quick response to that same question.
Sounds good. I'm going to quickly respond to the second part of that question. Where are the feminist movements in this struggle in Afghanistan? I think grassroots women's movements are it as far as Afghanistan goes. They are the ones defending human rights values and protecting civic space, what's left of it, right? They are the only civic resistance, the only consistent civic resistance against Taliban's oppression. And this goes back to before during the Doha peace process. As the Americans were making peace with the Taliban, Afghan women were saying, you're excluding us, you're ignoring human rights, and there is a price that the women of Afghanistan are going to pay, and you're disregarding that. And we saw that happen in practice. And the demands that they have are they're inclusive. They want the rights to education and employment, which impacts all. They want inclusive government. They are the ones speaking up for the rights of marginalized ethnic and religious groups that are under severe attack by the Taliban. And they do all of this while the international community is on its own track, which it was before, and they're moving towards more of so-called pragmatic engagement with the Taliban, which you can now imagine makes it much harder for women's movements, for feminist movements in Afghanistan to fight their fight, right? Because there is the Taliban that they're struggling against, and then there is the international community that they're trying to convince and say, we told you during the peace process, we are telling you now, these people are not going to change. And at the same time, we are seeing new announcements by the Taliban impacting the rights of women. So I think it's a fight in two fronts, and women's movements, women's grassroots movements are in the center of it. They're the face of it, and it's not easy. I feel like it's really difficult to have a win in this situation. For the past 1.5 years, it's only the voices from inside and women outside of Afghanistan that have been saying that human rights should be prioritized, and it's everyone against them, it feels like.
Okay, thanks, Zubaida. Okay, so next I'm going to turn to Anthea for a question about how you see tactics shifting. Can you name a tactic that seems to be on the rise in your work?
In terms of state participation, we're definitely seeing a race to the bottom in terms of language. So we're looking at negotiations and informals around resolutions, when we're looking at how states are engaging in interactive dialogues, they're really trying to water down what was previously agreed language, questioning what seems like it's obvious language, like literally in informals this week, questions about what is a human rights-based approach within the Human Rights Council. So really taking, really trying to erode any good language that we might have, really trying to impede any normative progress that we could have, really ensuring that when it seems like something progressive has happened, for example, resolutions, that the strength of that resolution is watered down by the fact that it had to be voted on. So refusing to adopt progressive language by consensus. In terms of states' participation in the UPR, for example, which is the space that's supposed to be for acculturation and cooperation, they're using the space to insert their particular narratives around rights, their particular values, their particular ideologies, by giving suggestions and recommendations that might not be in line with international human rights standards, but are very clearly in line with their own foreign policy priorities, their preferred interpretation of rights, and sometimes just a little bilateral squabbling that happens during the process. In terms of like far right or regressive civil society actors, my co-panelists have already spoken about how their main tactic is engagement. They're just always there. They have the resources to be there. They're showing up for everything. We, as the more progressive activists, are always asking, what's the point of the UN? Why should I go to CSW? Why should I go to the Human Rights Council? And really, at some point, it's about being a bouncer to keep out the regressive actors, to challenge their positions, to really hold the line. You might not be making progress, but we're trying to make sure that we don't go backwards. And another strategy that these actors have is that they don't have any qualms about talking to anybody. They will talk to any state. They'll produce information and evidence for anyone. Whilst we feminists might have qualms about talking to certain states. We might have progressive states or the good states, or donor states, or these states are bad. The far right doesn't have any of these qualms. And this is actually a very effective strategy because depending on the issue, you do have a lot of states that are the movable middle. Maybe they don't have a particular position on a particular issue. Maybe they don't have enough personnel to even have heard anything about a particular topic. And the far right present neatly packaged submissions and information notes, provide workshops, provide in-person support to these states. And they make it seem as though their ideas are really, really good ideas. They're fighting an ideological battle and a resource-driven battle. And sometimes they're winning.
That's true. If I'm going to be a bouncer, I want a uniform. With that said, Sussan and Rozana, same question, if I could. I'm looking at the clock, just a very quick response. Can you name one tactic that you see on the rise? Sussan, let's take you first, and then Rozana.
Yeah, so I just want to sort of say, thank you, Anthea, for that really important analysis. I want to say, actually, this was an important tactic by feminists. We started talking about what's happening at the international spaces and also national, regional levels back in starting, much earlier, but specifically in 2013 and 2014. Back then, Cynthia, you were part of that initial conversation. And we responded by creating ours, if you remember. So we were quite aware. So even if maybe now we're being picky and we're not being out there enough, we did recognize what was happening and we did take action. And I'm glad to see now, I was in a similar meeting recently organized by funders that was looking at these very same issues. So So I'm glad to see that, our feminist activism and our tactic has resulted, I mean, at least in the awareness of others who can have greater influence. I think, one really important tactic, I'm not going to talk about the tactic of the right, I'm going to talk about the tactic that we need as feminists, which is really essential for the region, is organizational life. The ability to organize, to set up, that civic space is absolutely, absolutely critical. And I can't speak enough as to how negatively it impacts our movements, this loss of space. And we see it, in the MENA region, we see it in every single country. I didn't mention Israel. I think I should mention Israel, because people talk about Israel as the democracy. It's not, we've had organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations that have been shut down, charged with terrorism. We have Israeli groups who are advocating for rights. They're also, they also get a similar negative reaction. So I think it's absolutely critical that we keep insisting on our ability to organize as civil society and in civic spaces. And we have the support of the international community. We can no longer take this wink and a nod by the international community, or this unbalanced approach, especially to this region, that it's okay for some countries to not have any civic space, but then some other countries are criticized for it, this weaponization of human rights and civil rights to attack, the foes of the Western world. We need a stress. And I think that making sure that feminist groups, women's groups have access to international spaces is also absolutely critical, even if in contexts like Iran, where a lot of those international resolutions perhaps are not very easily used, but they at least give us an excuse to talk about many of these issues that may be seen as sensitive. But I think those international spaces need to be open for civil society, and that's, not only governments need to step in here, but also funders need to step in and make sure that activists have, are able to attend the HRC, or CSW or other events where these countries and these issues are being discussed. People need, they need funds to be able to do it. And so that needs to happen. And I think a lot of times you hear for funders, well, why do they want to go to conferences? Why do you go to conferences? We need to go there to represent our issues, but also to make critical connections that will help further our cause.
So thanks, Sussan. So I'm looking at the time. Rozana, I'm going to ask you to name a tactic that you see on the rise. And then just as a heads up, I'm going to go back to each of you for a very fast closing comment. So Rozana, first to you, can you name a tactic that you see on the rise?
Definitely the use of TikTok. That is just, it's really affected how the not only the results, but the effect post-elections that we had last November. And it's really, the way we we're just not able to catch up, I feel, because how they're doing it, they're very, very well funded. They're very, very motivated. They really come to the clarion call. And somehow they're so effective. And I just, that is something that's, they're doing really, really well. And it's really is a struggle to figure out how to counter it, because not only it's about the content, but how fast they are viralized all throughout the nation. But I also just want to echo what Sussan has said about, feminists being better organized in order to do all of this, but really, with the resources really is a very critical issue that, we're, so under everything, not enough people, not enough money. And over the other side, they've got tons. So it really feels sometimes it's a losing battle, but we've just got to keep at it, because we cannot concede, let go of these spaces. And language as well, the local languages. We've got to also capture what we're doing and deliver it in the local languages. I think that is something that cannot be emphasized enough.
Great. Rozana, thank you so much. Okay, so now I'm going to turn back to each of you. I just posted in the chat to everyone. I think we are going to go just a few minutes over, but I'm going to ask you again for quick responses. I'm blending two questions here. They're a little bit disparate, but you're all brilliant. So let's see where you go with this. There was a question early on about advocating around secularism and secular states. So if any of you would like to touch on that in your 1 minute response, great, you don't have to. But the actual question that I'd like to pose to you as a closing comment is to share with us something that you feel hopeful about, whether that's about whatever that is in the landscape in which you work and live. Okay, and if I could just ask you to keep your responses to about a minute, that would be great. Anthea, may I start with you?
Sure. I'm going to go straight to gushing about what I'm excited about. Okay. So the Sexual Rights Initiative and some of our partners, we've been working on the Empty Chairs campaign. So emptychairscampaign.org. And it's about trying to think about what a people's council would look like. So I've obviously been complaining a lot about the Geneva system. But in this campaign, this project, we're really thinking about how it could be better, how it could be designed for the people, for all people, how we could eliminate those barriers that currently exist to our participation. And so it's really pulling some of those threads that were coming up from my panelists about the importance of civil society space and civil society participation. And so there are some components of it that were like the video projects, where we had activists from different parts of the world talking about what they think a people's council could look like. But we also think about it in terms of how we take up space in the Human Rights Council, how we engage with the different mechanisms, and how we ensure that we're not ceding this space, that we don't give up on what this council could look like and what it could do for us, because we think it can and should be better.
Fantastic. Thilaga, may I turn to you?
Oh, thank you. I think the circular versus religious state is a bit binary for me. And I think it's also a bit reactionary in the, to the context that we live in. As we see, secular states also have problems, right? Like as we have seen in France. So I think that, and I think the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion has also put together a report on these issues, looking at these tensions, right? So maybe we could take a look at that and have a separate discussion as well. I think there are many different types of creative organizing that's taking place. I'm also really happy to see how there's a trend of LGBT groups that are exploring and getting out of their comfort zones, including ourselves. Like, for example, from going out from our comfortable urban areas to rural areas, exploring new strategies and collaborations and tactics. And also, I think the pushback that we are facing is also has to do with the kind of progress that we're making, whether in country or globally. So I think there's also really deep analysis that is coming out of queer movements and like cross-movement building. So I think these are all really, really exciting things. And I think we will be able to change the world in 5 years. Yeah, no.
You think it's 5? That's the time frame, 5? Okay, I'm down.
Or maybe 3 years.
Okay.
Or 2 years. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, very good. Sussan, let's go to you and then the others.
So, when I started Femina, one of the reasons was because, in response to this growing extremism, religious extremism in the region, the voices of feminist movements and feminist activists were being sidelined because people, especially at the international level, were talking to others who address this kind of work, address peace work at least, from a religious perspective. And many of them didn't buy into or didn't adhere to human rights principles. And it was this huge alarm for me, because we know that feminist movements and feminists have been fighting and countering extremism and offering their own alternative narratives and visions of society for many, many years. And growth of extremism is not about religion, it's really about power. But so the positive thing that I see in recent years across this entire region, we see the emergence of young feminist activists in the most remotest of places, including in my country, Iran, but across the region. And I think it's beautiful. It tells me that us as the older generation, we've done something right. And despite the incredible repression that exists in almost all of these countries, these groups are rising up. They're establishing, formal where they can, but informal initiatives, and they're working to advocate for equality, to spread their vision of feminism, and advocate for the rights of structurally excluded populations. So that for me is extremely, extremely helpful, is that we have this younger generation, and most of them are so well informed. They have such incredible analysis. They're not just stepping up because they see something wrong. They've done this. They're doing this because they've analyzed the problem and they have real solutions. So for me, that's really the most hopeful thing that I see.
Lovely. Very good. Zubaida, let's go to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great. In my work in Freedom Now, we focus on identifying and working with grassroots human rights movements inside Afghanistan. We decided to start this campaign after we saw many organizations that we were familiar with don't exist anymore, and we wanted to see who are the human rights actors in Afghanistan now, what they're doing, and how we can support them. We continue to identify new groups and collectives every day in the remotest parts of the country who are demanding for their human rights. I'm hopeful that by connecting these movements with each other, helping them expand their work, we will keep the voices from Afghanistan coming, and we will help them with having their voices elevated, and at the end of the day, making sure that this time, after 20 years of major international intervention in Afghanistan, we will do it right, and we will change. We will start change from inside out.
Lovely. Okay, Rozana, over to you.
Echoing what Sussan has said about younger generation, there was this schoolgirl who basically took on her teacher in class because he made a rape joke. And so she did a video on TikTok. It just went totally viral. She got a lot of supporters, and then eventually she also got a lot of attacks, because it's that whole idea of how can you, say something against somebody who is, your teacher, older than you, blah, blah, blah. And she has basically just taken on, not only her school, her teacher, but also the entire education system, and has started campaigning for this making schools a safer space campaign. And she's just so wonderfully inspiring, and it's so nice to see that, yes, we are getting somewhere. I just want to say that I'm so grateful for the timing of this event, because I mentioned about the Court of Appeal decision we got 2 days ago, and I've been having kind of like a delayed reaction. So while the whole thing was happening, I was like, right, okay, what next do we have to do? And today I just have this overwhelmingly, like I got really, really emotional, and I just feel like I want to cry. I haven't cried yet, but I just feel like, it's coming. It's not there yet. It's not come out yet. But, it's just been really assuring to be a part of this, and to know that, we're on the right track. People can say whatever we want, but I think we're all on the right track. Thank you very much.
Rozana and others, just know that we're, the expression, we're in your back pocket. we're there with you, and that is true for all the participants also. I think we still have close to 50 folks on this call, and I'm going to turn this to Naureen, but first a very, very warm thank you to our panelists. I don't like calling you just panelists. You're just wonderful activists and fantastic people. A big thank you to everyone who has spent part of the morning, afternoon, or evening with us. A thank you to Amna and Naureen for all of the what we call the under the hood, like if you can imagine a car, under the hood tech things, etc. A warm thank you, and let me hand this to Naureen for a final close. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. Thanks so much, everyone. I love what all of you said, and Rozana, that we're on the right track. It's so heartening that we're here, that we're together, and to witness the power of feminist movements, and especially, as you were mentioning as well, Sussan, those that are on the rise, those fresh new views, those fresh new movements, and the tactics. So I too feel weird calling you panelists. I'd like to say thank you to an amazing set of feminist activists. You're amazing, you're inspirational. Thank you so much to our speakers, Rozana, Sussan, Anthea, Thilaga, and Zubaida for joining us today, and joining Noor in this important discussion as we've been talking about the work of feminist movements to disrupt and challenge the rising right in multiple regions, about transnational solidarity, and about how we can build power and harness this hope that we're talking about to address these kinds of roadblocks to the kind of feminist visions and feminist transformations that we all want and that we're aiming for. A big thanks also to Cynthia for facilitating this conversation. And a big thanks to all of you for joining and sticking around and really hoping to come together again, and really looking forward to taking these discussions and these steps we've been talking about forward. So thank you so much all for joining.